Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Elisa Martinez. I'm a licensed online psychotherapist, and I am joined today by Allison Ly. She is a licensed online psychotherapist. We're both in California, and we are going to be talking about self-care for adult children of immigrants. And this is a topic which is near and dear to both of us. So whether you identify as first gen, second gen, or anything in between, we hope that you'll find something here that resonates with you. So Allison is a therapist in California, I mentioned, and she helps first and second generation adults create happy and healthy relationships without sacrificing their dreams, their desires, and their mental health along the way. So we're going to be talking about that with Allison. So welcome. And
Thank you.
you want to share about you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think you covered most of it. I work in online. I'm here in California, and I really enjoy working with first and second generation adults just because I also identify as second gen. And this is like you mentioned, really near and dear to me. So I love what I do, and I'm happy to be here.
Yes, I'm so glad you're here. And Allison and I were talking a little bit earlier about, what's first gen, what's second gen. And um, I am second gen in that one of my parents was born outside of the country that I live in now. And so we're going to be talking a little bit more about some of those definitions. So I'm wondering if, let's get into that right now. What are some of the differences when we say first gen, second gen? Maybe you could outline that.
Yeah, so for first generation, it refers to those who were not born, and for us being in the US, outside of the US, right? So if someone was born in Vietnam or China or Mexico and they came over here, then they would be first generation. So my parents, they were born in Vietnam and they came over here, so they are first generation. They had me while in the US, so I am second generation. So when you're second generation, you have at least one parent who was not born in the country that you were born in.
Right. And we also were chatting about 1.5 gen, which is a term I don't hear a lot. Can you clarify?
Yeah, 1.5. So this is when an adult who immigrated over to the US when they were a child, probably under like 13, in a pretty young age, where they pretty much grew up in the country that they immigrated to. But because they didn't exactly grow up in another country, they're like 1.5, where you kind of like were born here and you like grew up here, having your childhood in the country you were living in.
Yes. Okay. Well, and so let's jump right in. What are some of the challenges that you see in your work as a therapist, right? Challenges around self-care for first and second gen folks.
Yeah, so the main thing that really highlights the challenges that these adults and, as children, they probably also faced is like the language barrier, right? Like if their parents, if their family members, caregivers, whoever they are supported by don't speak or are too familiar with the language, it can create a lot of barriers in just accessing like school, getting directions. All the street signs are like in English, and ordering food, like that is like the main barrier, I think. And that then puts a lot of responsibility, a lot of focus on the either children or adults now who know the language to really help the family, to really like guide them and support them. And when that is something that they are privileged to have access to as people born here or who grew up in the US, that can also become a lot of burden, responsibility. It can be very tiring to be the person to go to with all of these things, especially as children. So I think that's the main thing that I see, where then that kind of leaks over to a lot of other stuff, right? Technology, driving, like how do I go to college? Like how do I make money? How do I save for retirement? All these things within the system, at least here in the US, right? It's different. And then that gets put on the adult children a lot.
Yeah, yeah. And I really appreciate what you're saying because, I used to be an elementary school teacher and I would see my students, having to be the translators for their entire family, right? And if I'm just seeing that small piece of it, how else is that showing up for them, especially as they grow older in the family, right? Depending upon their family members' ability to, access via language, right? Resources and that kind of thing. So it is this extra added layer of stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and even if they do want to do it and are more than happy to do it, just like with anything else, too much task, too much responsibility can become tiring. And then where do we make the space for our own self-care, right? It can be easy to overlook or not thought about or just not done.
Yes, yes, no, exactly. And so you also were talking about this, both internal and external desire or pressure to, be the one who succeeds and does really well in their family. So wondering if you could speak a bit about that.
Yeah. So for a lot of my clients, right, they're predominantly Asian Americans of different backgrounds. And I know it's not like one culture, but there's a shared commonality of wanting to give back to the family, which is now a term like I've come to call the repay cycle. It's this framework of like the awareness that they have the skills and the knowledge and the privilege to be able to do certain things and access certain things, and then they have a desire to give back to their family, and then their family also know that, oh, I don't know how to do these things, so help me, right? Like there's also this expectation. It could just be actually pressure. It could be like just, oh, help me, like really just asking for help, right? Where they're not trying to be pressured, but then over time it becomes pressure or it becomes a lot. And yeah, that's so internally, usually the children of immigrant parents want to do well, want to help the family, but it can also be pressured into doing that because they have no one else to go to, especially if language is an issue.
Right, right, yeah. And there's that sense of they know that there is a lot, their success means a lot to the family, right? How successful they are is important. Yeah. And so,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So if they do well, then their family can like do well as well, right? And that is like also extra
Mhm.
pull, desire, and motivation for them as well as pressure.
Yes. And so any other challenges that you see? You've named kind of a couple of the real big ones, right? And so I work with a lot of first gen, second gen folks as well. And there are, I see a lot of that coming in. And I'm second gen in that one of my parents is born outside of the country, and that creates its own dynamics as well. But I wonder what other challenges that you see coming up.
I think with tying it back to that language piece, when the family members don't have as much support, if they've actually left their home, right? First of all, there's a lot of trauma, a lot of grief, a lot of adjusting that they have to do that is really difficult. I'm just even thinking of like if I had to switch schools when I was younger, that's already a difficult change, right? So imagine like leaving a country where everything was like so familiar to them and then having to like be less independent in some ways. Not that they're not independent, but it changes, or there's moments of like adjusting that needs to happen. So I think then community is really lost, and community is also very important in a lot of families, right? Where you have someone to go to kind of talk about things or not talk about things, just eat together, and just get that support, however that looks like for them in a way that they're familiar. So when they're in a new country and don't have that community, that can be very isolating. And then a lot of first and second gen children can also feel that emotional, social pressure to be that support for their families.
So a lot of stuff here, and it's multi-layered, right? It's multi-layered. And so let's talk about self-care, how adult children can take care of themselves, right? Given this context and given these dynamics. And yeah, I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I think the first step is really just recognizing the reality of what's happening. And I do this myself where a lot of times I'm like, oh, why did I get so upset? Right. Like if my mom asks me for help for something and it's like the fifth time I've taught her how to do this one thing on her phone, right? I
Mm.
get upset. And it's not that I'm a bad person. It's not that I don't want to help her or anything like that, but it's just sometimes it's frustrating. So we want to look at the facts and really practice that self-compassion of like, well, it makes sense, right? You've had a long day or not a long day, you just got upset, whatever it might be, and really offering that understanding that we can't always be like on our A game, right? We're all human and are entitled to our reactions and like to be tired. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think even just acknowledging the complicated nature of these dynamics that you were naming earlier, right? About being a, first or second gen and the role that you play in the family and the expectations at over time, um, how stressful that could be, right? Even if it's not in your conscious awareness, right? This is because it's just how you live. This is just what you know. Um, Giving yourself grace, yeah, about like, yeah, when you look at that big picture, it makes sense, that I'm not always going to be at capacity here, I'm going to get frustrated.
Yeah, and to really check in, right, at our capacity level and see, well, okay, if I'm really drained, like what can I do to actually re-energize myself to help myself so that in the long run I can continue to be there and to support them much longer than if I just like give, never take care of myself and I burn out. It'll be like much more difficult and much more painful to experience in that way. So I think really checking in, being aware, like you said, checking in with ourselves if we need a break, some sort of activity to like, I don't know, for re-energize, forget about some stressors, and then come back to it.
And I know you had also mentioned when we were talking earlier, offline, about this idea of small buckets of time. And I like that. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, the small bucket.
Yeah. I really like this idea because I like everything to be manageable, right? Where we don't want to be like, okay, well, I'm going to spend 2 hours away from my family and not talk to them, like when that may have never existed, and not realistic, right? What if we come into our room and we close the door and people are like knocking on our door asking for help? That may not be realistic. So what I like to do is kind of think about what can I do to create like 5-10 minutes of time for myself. Like, is it like resting, kind of going somewhere, doing something for myself, walking around the block right before coming home, listening to a song I like, before helping them with paperwork or whatever it is that they need, just so that, again, we have that little re-energy, like being re-energized, right, into like doing what it is that is needed of us.
Yeah, yeah. And in terms of also for first and second gen adults, getting their own support, right? And so what are some of the different ways that could look like?
Yeah, and that is such a huge one, right? Because the community that we were talking about for our caregivers, parents, grandparents is really important. So for us, it would be the same. And I think there could be a lot of different options, whether it's just through learning, even like through podcasts, videos, YouTube, that could be more of a like not one-on-one way of getting community, but you can still hear people's perspectives and stories and get support in that way. There's like a ton of like Facebook groups that we can join depending on what direction we're kind of wanting from that. There's in-person groups that therapists also provide, or community centers like parks and stuff that we can go to and join like an adult league if we'd like. Just being outside, probably just to kind of increase our access to people. But I think it's also going to be really important to find people who understand our values and why we're doing what we're doing, so that if we're talking about the tiringness or the frustrations of taking care of our family, people aren't just going to tell us to like Well, don't talk to them forever, like, because it may not work.
Right. And if you have friends or people, in your current support network who don't have that lived experience, right? They're not gonna really understand, and they may be well-intentioned in, trying to offer you advice about how to deal with it. But really connecting with people who, get it, right? And so I know just even on Instagram, right? There are tons of Instagram accounts for, adult children of immigrants, right? And just sharing their lived experiences. And so there are a lot of ways to connect depending on the level of connection, right? Whether it's direct one-to-one or, more removed in an online format. And so I know that this is a specialty, a niche of yours, working with adult children of immigrants. And so how can working with someone like you really make a big difference?
I think for me, at least with my lived experience, like I can really have that understanding in a different way. And, while I have my own experience too, it really is figuring out what the clients want for themselves and having that openness and like letting my clients discover what they want. So I think I know that was really important for me. So I would definitely, make sure that that is also available to my clients. And I think it's just like it's like a connection that it's kind of hard for me to explain, because I think like when I had a therapist who was also Asian American, like there was just like less that I had to explain. But when there was miscommunication or differences in our cultures, I was able to explain it and still have it be better understood than, with someone who didn't have the same background as I did.
Right. And if you're a client and you have a certain lived experience, right, and you're really, seeking or wanting that understanding, it can be, a form of emotional labor, right? To have to educate your therapist, right? About it, right? Which I get it in that relationship, as we're forming with our therapist, there is going to be that exchange of information and educating, so to speak. But does that kind of make sense? Like
Yeah.
to a therapist who kind of has that lens, right? Like the lens that you have. Yeah.
Yeah, like just to have that maybe like groundwork, right? But again, still explaining our own lived experiences, because it's even within each family member, it could be so different. So having that groundwork is really helpful so that it's a little less, of that emotional labor. And then maybe just like eases into the explaining a little bit more, especially if these are things like a client may have not talked about very much. It could be difficult to start.
Yeah, definitely. And is there anything else around self-care that you want to offer or share for the folks viewing this?
Yeah, I think the self-compassion piece and the grace is like the main one. And if I had to like add another one, it's just to really like look at facts, right? Like again, go back to the facts and really practice that um, looking at different perspectives and not focusing only on the negatives. Because I think for a lot of my clients, they end up thinking they're not doing enough, they're not good enough, or they need to do more. And yes, that may be true. Like maybe there could be more that we could do. And also what we're doing right now is a lot and is enough. And hopefully we give ourselves that acknowledgement.
Absolutely. So I'm wondering if folks want to, find out more about you and the work you do, how can they find you?
Yeah, so they can find me on my website. It's AllisonLyTherapy.com. So that's two L's and an I. And last name is Lee, but it's spelled Ly. And I'm on Instagram as well at Allison Ly Therapy.
Yeah. And I'm Elisa Martinez, as I mentioned, and I do work with a lot of Latinx clients, first and second gen, of course, and I bring that lens to my work. And I'm at elisamartineztherapy.com, here on Instagram at Creating Calm Confidence. So thank you so much, Allison, for just sharing your lens, your perspective with us. And I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks for creating the space for us to talk about this. I appreciate it as well.
Yeah, okay, well, thanks for watching, everyone, and we will see you again.
Right.
Bye.